Hi, everybody. Thank you for starting the class. Thank you for doing the pretest. For those of you who have done it, for those of you who have not, please see the link in the email that's in the class yesterday, kind of easing you into the class. Please do that. It'd be a lot of help, both for me and the department. It's kind of a way to ease you into a few of the kind of big concepts of the class, kind of get your feet wet. Remember, that's not something you're graded on, but it helps the department. Any questions about that, let me know. The sociology department does that for all the major classes, methods, theory, statistics, just to get a gauge on how students are learning. So today we are starting chapter 1 called Training Your Sociological Eye. And first, I want to say I put a couple articles in this chapter for you. One on student stereotypes, and then another on generalizations versus stereotypes. Two topics you'll find covered in this short beginning chapter. Chapter 2 is really where we get into the real thick meat and potatoes of sociology. Chapter 1, I think, eases you in kind of easily. You also notice I put a PowerPoint on UB Learns in the chapter 1 chapter. There'll be a PowerPoint for every chapter in addition to the video lecture. The PowerPoint does not have any pretty pictures compared to, say, what you might get in a face-to-face class, but what the PowerPoint outline is, or what the PowerPoint is essentially an outline. So when you're reading the chapter, doing anything else, reading the additional material, watching the additional videos, as we start to do things in discussion board, start thinking about our short papers that we'll be doing. When you're listening to the video lecture, you can think of the PowerPoints as outlines you can fill in as you go through the material. And so that would be the best way to prepare for the exams. So the PowerPoints don't tell you anything new, but what they do is they give you some structure to help think about the lectures and your reading with. So consider using them for that. I think they're a very good outline that also kind of breaks the chapter down into its bare bones for you, and then you can kind of build outward from that. So to start, yesterday I posted those two videos, one on generalizations and stereotypes, the other on student stereotypes, as a way to get you thinking about what sociologists do and what they think about. And so we're going to start out by thinking about how sociology is the study of how individuals shape and are shaped by society. So notice how in this definition people do things, they have agency, they have the ability to make decisions, take action, choose different choices, engage in different kinds of behavior. So people are not totally powerless. We're not just automatons who are programmed. But we also have to recognize that we are shaped by plenty of forces outside our control. Were you born into a rich or poor family? A religious or a non-religious family? In a city or in a rural area? In a first world country or a developing country? Were you born with a disability or not? Are you gay, bisexual, or heterosexual? So all of these things are structures that affect our life chances, There are certain things we have no control over. Who your parents are, who you want to love, the kind of place you grew up in, all impact what your eventual outcomes may be. Even if we can totally transcend the hardship we encounter, maybe escaping a poor rural area and becoming some urban billionaire with our name on a skyscraper, the path to that privileged point is extremely long and hard and arduous, full of sacrifice, compared to someone born in a more affluent position. So even if we think that people can be extremely successful, which they can, the path is longer, harder, and they may not get to that point as young as someone else. So by the time they're a big shot, they might be 30 or 40. For someone else, maybe so let's take our current president, Donald Trump, comes from an extremely wealthy family, inherited extreme amounts of wealth, became a real notable figure long before his political career and his reality TV career, was a big player in the New York State real estate scene in his early to mid-20s because he inherited all of that money, prestige, and power. So that path was really laid out for him, whereas for someone else, they really had to scrap and work their way up from the bottom. So that's really what sociology has us think about, are the various processes and pathways by which people from very different backgrounds have very different experiences and paths towards who they become. And so if we're going to have a good example of this in terms of doing some of your own learning, the section in the chapter and some additional material, you'll see Malala Yousafzai, the first Nobel Prize winner from Pakistan. So imagine being Pakistani. Some of you in this class might be Pakistani. It's a very international student roster in this class, as they often are for international, or for summer online classes. Most of the international students at UB take them. Those of you who don't know, UB, about 20% of UB students are international students. So some of you, this maybe rings true for you, but growing up Pakistani compared to American, in Pakistan compared to America, and all the different religious and cultural scripts and forces people have to navigate compared to growing up somewhere else. That's a really good example, and I would suggest checking that out to think about that as kind of an individual case or example of what sociology is trying to teach us and have us think about. So as I mentioned in the video, in the intro lecture, the kind of intro to the course that I sent you yesterday, sociologists basically think about, in many ways as well, what we would call social problems. So on page 5, our textbook authors start talking about how sociologists study things like economic inequality, say like poverty, environmental racism. So environmental racism is having us think about how, say, parts of the country where minority populations are concentrated, say like poor neighborhoods in cities, they're more likely to be exposed to pollution and toxicity. So an example of this would be, say, the Bhopal disaster in India, for those of you who are familiar with that. Another way to think about it would be what populations are going to be affected by the consequences of global warming and climate change. those are likely to be poorer, non-white populations in poorer parts of the world. Those will be the populations impacted by climate change before anyone else. We also have things like gender discrimination, warfare, terrorism, religious persecution, natural disasters, governmental overthrows, things like segregation, gentrification, all terms you may be familiar with. So sociology in many ways has us study, basically, in a lot of ways in which the world is a hard place to live in for a lot of people. That's kind of the social problems perspective. Social problems is usually the course people take immediately after intro to sociology. And so that's kind of the social problems way of thinking about sociology. And we think about social problems with what we would call our sociological eye. So here I'm kind of on page 5, working to page 6. And so the sociological eye allows us to think beyond the surface. And so we can really think about this as thinking critically, but I'm always a little reluctant to have us thinking about sociology as teaching us critical thinking, which it does, but not emphasizing it too much, because every class says it's trying to teach you critical thinking. And it also implies that you've never thought critically before you came to this material, which I don't think is true, because I think students are smart. And they think in deep, complicated ways that are very sophisticated, and so telling students you're going to teach them how to critically think is a little disingenuous. But what sociology does do, when we think about what is a sociological eye, is that it's teaching us to think about what are some underlying things that are happening, what is really happening beneath the surface. So, for example, in a workplace, you might think, why are certain people getting promoted over others? And the logical choice is that we assume people getting promoted are the best workers, they're the most productive, most efficient, performing the best. When you look a little deeper, do some digging, you may find out that people who get promoted have some personal ties to other people higher up in their workplace, say through their family. Maybe they live in the same neighborhood. Maybe their kids go to school together. And so those personal ties may play a factor in them getting promoted compared to people who are essentially strangers. That's not to take away from the fact that some people are better workers than others, but some non-performance related personal things might play a role in who sees workplace promotion over others. And so that's where a sociological eye has us thinking about basically what is fully going on. What is the comprehensive picture? What's happening beneath the surface? That's what sociology really is. I'm also realizing my forehead looks huge on this video. So try to keep eye contact and just avoid staring at this the best you can. That was your comic break, of which there will be many. Usually in face-to-face classes, I tell jokes and I hear nothing, which makes me think I'm not that funny. But in an online class, I get to tell all the jokes I want and not really worry about whether I'm funny or not until I read your course evaluations. But more seriously, moving on from the sociological I, we're going to move towards what's called the sociological imagination. So this is turning our sociological I on ourselves. So here we're thinking about the ability to connect what's happening with our own life, and maybe the lives of other individuals, to social patterns in larger society. So you might think, oh, I went to University of Buffalo because all my friends were going to University of Buffalo, and that just seemed like what people did in my high school, and I never really thought about going to Buffalo State and being in the city more, saving money and going to Erie Community College or Niagara Community College. I really wanted to go to a small private school like Medaille or DUville and have really small classes and get to know my professors better, but just everyone seemed to go to University of Buffalo. That seems to be the best option in the Buffalo area, and I just did what everyone else was doing and followed that path without thinking about what I really wanted. So that's an example of the sociological imagination, is thinking about how your decision making was influenced, impacted, even coerced compared to others. What would you do differently in the past if you had the information you have now? Maybe your parents are forcing you to go to college and they said they're only going to University of Buffalo because your parents are alumni and there were no other options. In which case, that's an example of how the family is a social structure that really shapes and in some cases dictates a lot of our outcomes. So to think about sociological I, sociological imagination, I want us to look at figure 1.1 on page 7, which has us thinking about escalating student loan debt. From 1993 to 2016, the average amount of student loan debt for an undergraduate has gone from about $9,000 to about $37,000. Why is that the case? Why do you think that's the case? That's what a sociologist would ask, is why in 25 years-ish, from early to mid-90s to the very late 20-teens, why is average student loan debt almost tripled? That's what a sociologist would ask. Think about things like economic questions like inflation, maybe education policy changes, student choices. So a sociologist would try to think about why is this happening. And that's where you'd really want to check out that New York Times article that I put in the chapter 1 chapter, because there's kind of a assumption in our culture that college students are this extremely pampered, privileged class of students, all in fraternities and sororities, just partying all the time. And that's only a small subset of college students. A lot of students are working. They have kids. They're taking summer classes like this one so they can graduate maybe early or at least on time, trying to save money, living at home with their parents. And so that's a really good kind of example to think about, one, how students are avoiding escalating student loan debt, but also having us think about moving past, kind of think about what is really happening and really going on with college students. Sociologists also have us think differently or at least beyond what we would call the individualistic perspective, which is kind of this perspective that kind of in America we call bootstrapperism, which is that anyone can do anything and be anything they want to be regardless of their situation and upbringing. People have great capacity to improve their situation in life, but the individualistic fallacy basically says that there are no obstacles in your path, that only you are your own obstacle. Sociologists has the thinking about that some people have a lot more obstacles than others. So, if you want to think about whether you succeed or fail, depends largely on your own efforts. You have to think about what different types of experiences, resources some people have over than others. And so, think for example, if you're a first-generation college student, you may not really have your parents as an educational resource helping you with navigating college like people with college-educated parents. So in which case, being a first-generation college student is just much harder than if your parents went to college. So that's an example where obviously plenty of first-generation students get college degrees, but their path is harder. Thinking a little bit into future chapters, what we call the theoretical perspectives of sociology. That's largely chapter 2. And as I mentioned in the intro video yesterday, we're largely thinking about a few things: social problems, social structures, patterns, how society stays the same, how it stays stable. Why are we not living in some post-apocalyptic wasteland where everyone's battling each other for resources like in Mad Max or The Walking Dead? The other is social change, how society changes. Think reform, revolution. We elected new presidents of different political parties. Governments get overthrown. We give new populations rights, like, say, gay marriage. So that's where society's changing. And then I also mentioned, as we'll get into, interpretivism, which is the different meanings people attach to behavior. And then last but not least, kind of thinking back to the New York Times article I mentioned about stereotypes about college students, sociology is also largely about seeing patterns. So that's a structure, right? Social patterns. Think about the difference between generalizations and stereotypes. So generalization would be a pattern that we see across a certain kind of population. A stereotype, on the other hand, which is more negative, is basically a negative trait that we assume a person from a population has, and then we view them positively or negatively if they do not have that trait. So, for example, there are stereotypes that all Irish people are drunks. So then if, let's say they don't drink at all, we act surprised and be like, oh wow, you're a good Irish person because you don't drink. Or take, for example, the textbook mentions we assume all Asian people are good at math. So then if an Asian person isn't good at math, we think of them as a bad Asian. And so that's an example of a stereotype where we think that there's a particular trait associated with someone from that group, so then we are shocked, positively or negatively, if they do not have that trait. And so we reduce populations to that trait. I think that's all I got. This already went longer than I planned. But definitely look and think about the stereotypes and generalizations material that I added to UB Learns, because that's kind of a good way to start thinking sociologically, is this difference between generalizations and stereotypes. That's an opportunity for you to also teach yourself a little bit. That's chapter 1. Thanks for hanging out with me. For now, until Wednesday, you're just doing the pretest and getting your feet wet with the material in chapter 1. Chapter 2 begins Wednesday, and with chapter 2, you will then have your first discussion board post, 1 of 6, due, and I will give you the details about that then. So we're easing in slow, but then it'll take off. Any questions, shoot me an email. Please do the pretest. I need you to do that. And that's it for now. Talk to you soon. Go be sociological.